everyone, and welcome to the lineup for this June the 13th, 2024. I'm Barry Stagner. Very glad to have you with us. And, we've been talking the past couple of weeks about, prayer needs and things going on. And we all have people that need prayer in our lives. And I just wanted to thank you guys again for those who've been praying for the things I mentioned specifically. And especially when we're talking about Elena, little gal at the church. She's actually one of our pastor's daughters. And she was at church on Sunday. So thank you for praying. Just continue to lift her up in prayer. And also, I know there's a lot of fellowship that goes on and reconnecting that happens in the chat while the program is airing. And I just want to encourage those who are watching to keep an eye out for those prayer needs too. And after the fact, when, the live YouTube, their practice is the live will then switch and the chat will close, and then it will go into just, those who click on it to watch it later. But there's also comments there too. Please pray for me for this or that other thing. And let's be praying for these things. I think all of us need prayer these days with so much going on in our world. And that's why we get together. That's why fellowship is so important and lifting up one another in prayer. So please do so and pay attention to these things because it matters and God does answer prayer. And so thankful that he is still attentive to our needs and desperate hours as many are in. So with that said, let's jump in. We've got a host of stories, and I think a lot of times we'll come to a particular batch of stories in any given week and just think, like that old phrase, stranger than fiction, or truth is stranger than fiction. And we've got a couple of those this week, and we'll talk about those as they arrive. And I'm sure most of us are well aware, as the Times of Israel reports, that on the Feast of Weeks, during the Feast of Weeks, I should say, 215 rockets were fired at the north of Israel after IDF killed a senior commander or officer from Hezbollah. Hezbollah launched some 215 rockets and several more missiles and drones at northern Israel on Wednesday in what it said was a response to the killing of a senior commander in the terror group by an Israeli airstrike a night earlier. The barrages marked the largest attack carried out by Hezbollah during ongoing fighting on the Lebanon border amid the war in the Gaza Strip, and the terror group vowed to ramp up its attacks in retaliation for Israel's elimination of top commander Talib Abdullah. At a funeral procession in Beirut, senior Hezbollah official Hashem Safiadini said the group would increase the intensity, the force, and the quantity of all its operations against Israel. And if the enemy is screaming and moaning about what happened to it in northern Palestine, let him prepare himself to cry and wail, Safiadini said. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu held a security assessment Wednesday evening in light of the developments in the north, his office said, and the successive Hezbollah attacks began on Wednesday morning with a barrage of at least 90 rockets fired at several areas in northern Israel, including Tiberias for the first time amid the war. Safed and Rosh Pina sending tens and thousands of people to shelters as Jewish Israelis celebrated the Shavuot holiday. The Israel Defense Forces said 70 rockets were then launched in the Mount Meron area, home to a sensitive air traffic control base, and 10 more rockets were fired at the northern community of Zarit, and an anti-tank guided missile struck a factory of the Plasan armored vehicle manufacturer in Kibbutz Zaza, causing damage. Now, again, we mentioned last week that Syria is not the only country on the northern border of Israel. And we do know that Israel is going to be attacked from the north. And, we have to include those who may not be directly named in the Ezekiel war scenario. But, when things heat up on the northern front, either side, there's a proxy behind these are proxies, I should say, with a financier and provider of military hardware behind them. And that would be the Persians, who are directly named in the Ezekiel war scenario, the Iranians of today. So things are heating up. Again, the president of the United States jumped in and said, we need to get things calmed down. Things are getting real serious on the northern border of Israel. And, people have just been waiting for that. I think anybody in the know, especially in Israel, as a matter of fact, we were supposed to be in Israel a couple of weeks ago, and conversations with Amir, we thought it best not to go. And, why? Because of what's happening in the north. I don't know if I'm sure most of you follow Amir on Telegram, but one of the things he put up that I've never seen him put up before was a map of where these missiles and rockets were hitting and the general location of where he lives. And, he even posted, our bomb shelter's ready. So if you don't hear from me for a while, you'll know that's where I am. So again, this is serious business. We have to remember there are 250,000 rockets and missiles aimed at Israel from Lebanese territory. 10% of these, or 25,000 of these, have smart technology. In other words, they're not just a dumb bomb, drop it, see where it lands, influenced by the wind and other things. And these are weapons that are sophisticated in nature, that have a target selected and pointed, and that's where they'll hit. So, this is serious business. And watching things heat up on the northern border reminds us that that is the very direction, that there will be a mass invasion of Israel, and God is going to wipe out these armies and leave them dead on the mountains of Israel, 5, 6 of them, that is. It will take, according to Ezekiel, 7 months, to bury the dead. I don't know where 30 came from. 7 months to bury the dead, and 7 years to burn the weapons and all that. So a lot going on today, and watching things heat up reminds us that we were told what to watch for. And that's one of the things I think that's so strange about prophecy deniers and those who, just want to allegorize the book of Revelation or say that the Olivet Discourse was completely fulfilled, which is absolutely ridiculous. Back in 70 AD, where the preterist wants to claim that everything happened, all prophecies were fulfilled, save the second coming of Christ for the partial preterists. But that's just nonsense, because the truth of the matter is, there weren't wars and rumors of wars, pestilence, distresses of nations, ethnic tensions, famines, earthquakes in diverse places, and all those things. There was the hatred of the Roman emperor for the Jews, and this was expressed through Titus, the general, and he destroyed the city of Jerusalem. But none of those other things ever happened. And so you have to take a part of it and make it literal, and then another part of it and make it allegorical, which is not, the Bible uses allegory, there's no question about it, but it always identifies it. And let me give you an example. When we look at the book of Revelation, one of the things we see is repeated words like, as if, and things along those lines. When we see descriptions of things that John had never seen, and remember, he was thrust into the future and was trying to describe things that would be timeless. Like, he had the voice like the sound of many waters. Now, it doesn't mean that his voice sounded like a waterfall or a rushing river. He's trying to describe the volume level that would be understood in any generation. Or, some of the things that come up out of the bottomless pit, had a face like a man. It wasn't a man's face, it was face like a man, and hair like a woman. And it wasn't women's hair. It was hair, obviously implying that it was long, like a woman's hair. So when the Bible wants us to understand that imagery is being presented in an allegorical form, or figuratively, what's being described still is true about a literal event. And even though figurative language can be used, it's pointing to something that is actual and reality. And, none of the things in Matthew 24, 3-8 happened in 70 AD. One thing happened, and that is Jerusalem was destroyed. And therefore, we know all the other things that are surrounding the events in 70 AD have not yet happened. Therefore, they are not historic, but they are future. And I think the future is coming to an end as far as that goes, and when those things are going to be fulfilled, which is any minute now, I believe, and we'll be going home. I love, there's a song, I think, Crystal Lewis, I'm not sure if she's the first one to ever sing it, but, one of the lines that go in this powerful song is people get ready. Jesus is coming soon. We'll be going home. And I can't think of a better day than today. And if he doesn't come today, tomorrow will be even better for us to have that moment and twinkling of an eye experience and forever be with the Lord. Now, the Algerminer reports that a top Biden aide asserts the U.S.-backed ceasefire deal can remove Hamas from Gaza. Now, this was a major sticking point for accepting any of the proposals that were coming out of the U.S. administration or elsewhere. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on Tuesday argued that the ceasefire deal currently being pushed by President Joe Biden to end the fighting between Israel and Hamas could result in the removal of the Palestinian terror group from power in the Gaza Strip. Well, of course, Hamas has other ideas. And Sullivan made the comments while speaking to a packed crowd at the American Jewish Committee Global Forum 2024 event. He asserted that the ceasefire plan will lead to a Gaza where Hamas is no longer in power. And that, I think, is kind of double talk, because it's not that Hamas just no longer needs to be in power. Hamas needs to no longer be. They have to be eliminated, because whether they're in power or not, they're going to keep doing the things they have done all along. And the top White House advisor stated that the deal will pave the path for an interim security enterprise and an interim governance enterprise that will eradicate the terrorist threat within Gaza. Sullivan also claimed that the plan will help bolster Israel's security concerns while improving Palestinian living standards. On May 31st, the Biden administration unveiled a new ceasefire deal to resolve the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas. And the three-phase deal would ultimately establish a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, flood the war-torn enclave with international aid to kickstart the rebuilding process. However, the proposal would seemingly leave a weakened form of Hamas in power, a condition that Israel has repeatedly refused to accept. Hamas leaders have also expressed doubt about the deal, arguing they will not accept any agreement that requires their disarmament. Well, that pretty much states their intentions, their long-term goals, and everything else that Israel is claiming is the reality. And yet the world is so blind to these things and just living in a state of delusion. And, we know that, the apostasy, the apostasia is a Greek word, will happen in the last days, and it's a defection from truth. And I was mentioning in a message not too long ago that, of course, studying the Bible, we always think it'll be a defection from biblical truth and apostolic doctrines and all that. And we have certainly seen that. But truth, just general truth, biological truth, has been abandoned. And it's just incredible to watch the things that are happening today. And this delusion and this just bizarre thinking today has made its way into the thinking of so many around the world. And regardless of facts, regardless of what happened on October 7th, people are anti-Semitic. And it's biblical, but it just is one of those head-scratching things. As Sullivan went on to talk about some of the other specifics and the UN Security Council's decision to pass the ceasefire proposal, placing additional pressure on Hamas to the table. However, he stressed agreement from both sides of the conflict is not a foregone conclusion, noting the work painstakingly done by the Biden administration. Sullivan said the UN Security Council vote created a diplomatic opening that allowed the U.S. to work with international partners to place the spotlight on Hamas. And, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome. And, the interesting thing about this is that they have already been flooded with money. They've received billions of dollars from countries all over the world. And what did they do? They built a massive system of tunnels. And all of them pointed at the destruction of Israel. And that is their goal. That's why they teach their kids to hate the Jews. That's why we have found clearly, undeniably, that some of these tunnel access points are in people's homes. I mean, we just went through something where there were hostages being held in a private house. And so this is not just, this radical group, but, when you've got a group that celebrates in the street and passes out candy, when Jews are killed, and some of them just unbelievably cruel, intentionally cruel ways, burned alive and killing babies and all the other horrific things that we've heard. And yet, so many today want to say, well, that's exactly what Israel is doing. Well, they didn't start this. And, if, I'm sure many of you got the same counsel that I got from my dad when I was a kid. And that is, you don't start a fight, but you end it. And I think every kid has probably heard something like that or some fashion or form growing up, and that's kind of the mentality we have here. Israel didn't start this, and as the old saying goes, if Hamas laid down their weapons, there'd be peace. If Israel laid down their weapons, there'd be no Israel. And that is the stated intention in their charters and school books and everything else of the Palestinian people. It's not just Hamas, it's the desire of most Palestinians as well. And that's why they pass out candy in the street when Jews are killed. That's why they did the same thing on September 11th, 2001, when 3,000 plus Americans were killed. They celebrated because they are taught and believe that the United States is the great Satan and Israel is the small Satan. And they need to destroy Satan. That is their desire and their goal. Now, the Jewish News Syndicate reports that Hamas' response to hostage proposal is unworkable, according to Blinken. Hamas officials' official response to Israel's hostage for ceasefire proposal included modifications that are not workable, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on Wednesday. And Hamas had proposed numerous changes to the proposal that was on the table. And some of the changes are workable, some are not, Blinken said in a press conference alongside Qatari Prime Minister Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani in Doha. A deal was on the table that was virtually identical to the proposal that Hamas made on May 6th, a deal that the entire world is behind, a deal Israel has accepted. Hamas could have answered with a single word, yes, the secretary said. Instead, Hamas waited nearly 2 weeks and then proposed more changes, a number of which go beyond positions that had previously taken and accepted, added the top American diplomat who was in Israel for a 2-day visit earlier this week. And as a result, the war Hamas started on October 7th with its barbaric attack on Israel and Israeli civilians will go on. More people will suffer, more Palestinians will suffer, more Israelis will suffer. And again, this gets back to the fact that the Western culture just doesn't seem to understand the ideological mindset and the religious elements of that in the Middle East, being primarily Muslim. They do not have the respect for life that other countries do. The Western thinking just seems to be they can't get away from understanding the fact that they're not concerned about death. Because death as a martyr is the one way to be assured of life in paradise. If you die as a martyr, you go to paradise and all the other things we've heard that go along with that. But, according to Islam, if you died of natural causes, in the end, you're going to have your good works weighed against your bad works or misdeeds, so to speak. And if the balance is heavy to good works over bad deeds and misbehavior, then you get to go into paradise. So the shortcut for them is death and to die the death of a martyr. And that's why we heard, with when the Iranian president died, they immediately called him a martyr, even though he died in just a kind of a mechanical malfunction or whatever it may have been. He didn't really die a martyr. He died in a crash. And, again, just this whole thinking seems to be so hard for U.S. officials and others to get through their head. They don't care about dying because dying is, to them, a free pass, so to speak, into the paradise. Now, All Israel News says Hamas guards reportedly ordered to kill hostages if the IDF attempts a rescue. And, it's sad to see so many Western news outlets using the Hamas rhetoric to describe the rescue of 4 hostages some days ago, and they're calling it a release. Again, trying to turn the world against Israel and just flat out lie. These hostages were not released. They were rescued. And the guards in response to this have now been ordered to kill hostages. And of course, this is an attempt to keep Israel from trying to come in and rescue more. And the leaders of the terrorist organization Hamas reportedly told their operatives guarding Israeli hostages that if they think Israeli forces are coming, the first thing they should do is shoot the captives. This is from the New York Times on Monday of this week. They were citing Israeli officials. The New York Times report comes just 2 days after Israel's special forces rescued 4 Israeli hostages in a daring daytime raid in Nuseirat, a neighborhood in central Gaza. The successful rescue operation was named Operation Arnon to honor the IDF counterterrorism elite soldier Arnon Zamora, who was fatally wounded. Hamas spokesman Abu Obaida claimed that 3 other Israeli hostages were killed during the raid. However, IDF spokesman Peter Lerner quickly denied that Israeli forces had killed any hostages during the rescue operation, calling it a blatant lie. An unnamed Israeli official told the New York Times that if any Israeli hostages were killed during the raid, it might have been at the hand of the terrorists, not because of an Israeli airstrike. And Hamas chief in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, has allegedly spread out the hostages across multiple locations to deliberately make rescue operations more difficult for the IDF troops. So the 4 hostages rescued on Saturday were allegedly held in 2 separate buildings approximately 200 meters apart, 650 feet. Israeli counterterrorism strategists reportedly decided to send troops simultaneously to both locations due to fears that Hamas terrorists could potentially murder some of the hostages if finding out about a rescue operation in the other building. Now, while Israeli forces have successfully degraded much of Hamas' military capabilities and eliminated some 15,000 terrorists since the invasion and attack on October 7th, Israel has so far not been able to reach Sinwar. He and other top Hamas officials in Gaza are believed to be hiding below ground somewhere in the vast network system. Pardon me just one second. Have to close everything up here in the my office/studio, and it's hot in here. Finally, we're starting to see some sunshine here in Southern California. You know, watching some of the stories, and just kind of a side note, coming out of Florida, one where there was 4 inches of rain in an hour. Another section of southern Florida got 17 inches of rain in a day. And I'm sure you've heard about May gray, June gloom, and then July fry here in Southern California. But it's been very strange this year. We've had multiple days where, like weeks on end, there's actually a mist, a sprinkle going on. The marine layer is so thick here in Southern California, and the one benefit is things are still really green here, which is unusual for this desert area. But it's just been a really strange year. And my wife and I have talked. You know, we sit out in our backyard in the early evening or late afternoon. And it's been very curious that, you know, for years we've talked about the fact we lived in the same house for 23 years. We're not too far from the ocean. And every afternoon about 3 o'clock, we get a little breeze coming up. And but now there's no breeze. It's wind blowing everything around, making it almost uncomfortable to be outside. But here's the interesting thing about it. The wind, when it does come up, you know, it's not that warm summer breeze that the song's been written about and all that. It's cold. It's a cold wind. It's very interesting. Things are very different. And let me just say this: it's not climate change. It's just weather. Things change. You know, we've had ice ages in the past, and then things heated up. We've had hot spells in the past, and then things cooled down. I mean, that's just the cycle, the normal cycle of things. So, but it's curious that all this is going on, and these weather anomalies, which remember when Jesus talked about in Matthew 24:3-8, when he was asked about the signs of his coming and the end of the age, he included seismos, and all these things were happening or are to happen in a birth pang like progression. And that's what that, you know, labor pains on a pregnant woman that we often hear talked about, where that comes from, verse 8 in Matthew 24. But, you know, the interesting thing about this is seismos is not as soon as we hear the word, our minds go to earthquakes, but it's not limited to earthquakes. Seismos can mean a gale or a tempest. So the point is, this would include atmospheric events like unusual wind, heavy amounts of rain, all these other things we're seeing happening all around the world. And let me just say this, it's not climate change, it's biblical. And watching these things happen, again, should remind us, man, we're close. We are getting close. I just can't see how things could go on much longer, especially in light of some of the things happening around the world that are just so bizarre that we never could have dreamed that any of this stuff would actually happen in many of the countries of Europe. Certainly not here in America, but that's a kind of a segue into our next story. And get this, it comes from Breitbart, but it's been reported in multiple media outlets. And listen to this headline. Thugs on the New York City subway car tell Zionists to leave. A man accompanied by a group of masked thugs in a New York City subway car on Monday asked Zionists to raise their hand, identify themselves, adding that it was their last chance to get off while the train was in motion. The shocking incident happened as protesters were on their way to Lower Manhattan to protest an exhibit about the Nova music festival in Israel, where Hamas terrorists murdered roughly 400 people on October 7th. At the protest, activists displayed slogans such as, "Long live October 7th." Again, this is not Gaza, this is New York City. And waved Hezbollah flags, among other radical symbols. The White House and Mayor Eric Adams condemned the protest. And according to news agencies, the protesters had gathered in Union Square before descending into the subway station to take trains to Wall Street, where the exhibition is being held. Zionism is the belief that Jews have a right to a state in the historic and religious Jewish homeland of Israel. So listen, people just say the kookiest things about being supportive of Israel. We don't blindly support Israel. We support Israel's right to exist. It is their national homeland given to them by unconditional, everlasting covenant by God himself. And man cannot undo the things that God has done. That's why Amos would say, when they come back into the land, they will not be uprooted. Jeremiah talked about the same type of thing. So we believe the Jews have a right to a state in the historic and religious Jewish homeland known as Israel. If you believe that, and you should, then you're a Zionist. Now, almost all Jews share that belief and are Zionists, the article says. And the term Zionist is often used by anti-Semites as a euphemism for Jews. The New York Post went on to report masked anti-Israel protesters took over a New York City subway car on Monday and demanded to know about the Zionists and warned them, as the article said, that this is your chance to get out. Well, the event and those who were present said no one appeared to raise their hand, according to a clip widely shared online Tuesday. And the gentleman, I shouldn't say the gentleman, the jerk, I should say, said, "Okay, no Zionists, we're good," he said as others cheered. Earlier, a man in Union Square told a group of Jewish counter-demonstrators that he wished Hitler were there. Now, remember, the Bible talks about a strong delusion to believe the lie. And this, I think, is one of the things that needs to be pointed out, and why I believe in the lateness of the hour, and that we could be experiencing that twinkling of an eye experience that we're all longing for very soon. Because during the tribulation, and remember, it doesn't last long enough for the mentality and attitude to develop during that time, though I do believe it will be exacerbated by the rapture of the church and create an even greater hatred for the followers of Christ than that which is already present, and it's present today. And that is that during the tribulation period, the earth dwellers, as they're called in the book of Revelation, are going to be complicit or in agreement with the Antichrist, which makes him complicit in the death of millions and millions of people who have the testimony of Jesus and the Word of God. So this hatred, believing that Israel has a right to exist, believing what the Bible says about their national homeland, believing that the Bible said they're going to come back into that national homeland in the last days, They'll come back in a progression of things described in Ezekiel 37. But we also have to remember Ezekiel 36 said why they're coming back. And that is that in verses 21 and 22 of Ezekiel 36, the Lord said, I'm not doing this for you, I'm doing it for me. Because when you are outside of the land I gave you and promised you, you are profaning my name. So I'm bringing you back for my name's sake, says the Lord. Now, in another incident at this time, during the same protest, the director of the Brooklyn Museum and Jewish members of the museum's board were targeted overnight Tuesday into Wednesday. Their homes were vandalized and anti-Semitic graffiti, the Washington Post reported. Anti-Israel protesters have demonstrated at the Brooklyn Museum, even occupied the building earlier this month, damaging artwork and harassing staff, according to NBC News. And 34 activists were eventually arrested by police. Now, remember Zechariah 12:3 says the whole world is going to be against the Jews. The whole world will see Jerusalem as a burdensome stone. Jerusalem, in this case, being representative of the Jewish people, much like when people talk about Washington, D.C., they're talking about the American country and its people. So the thing we have to remember about Zechariah 12:3, that Jerusalem becoming a burdensome stone to all nations, it's the people in the nations, not just the administrations, but the people are going to see Jerusalem as a burdensome stone. And this is manifesting itself. I mean, this is not government action here. This is just everyday people who hate the Jews so much they'll destroy art. They'll threaten people just trying to get home from work in a subway car. And this continues to grow around the world. Jesus is coming soon. Keep your eyes lifted up and be expectant of that moment of twinkling of an eye when we will forever be with the Lord. Now, the Associated Press is reporting that Putin's fleet of warships in Cuba is a direct warning to Biden, experts say. And Putin has threatened in recent days to arm America's adversarial neighbors, which obviously would be Cuba. And a fleet of Russian warships entered Cuban waters on Wednesday as they prepare to hold military drills in the Caribbean. The deployment is likely a warning to President Biden after he gave approval for Ukrainian forces to strike some targets within Russia using U.S. weaponry, according to Rebecca Koffler, strategic intelligence analyst and author of Putin's Playbook. Russian President Vladimir Putin is telling Washington, "We can touch you," Koffler said. Putin wants to be close to the U.S. homeland at this time when the Russian-Ukraine crisis is on a highly escalatory trajectory, given Biden's authorization to Ukraine. If something goes wrong and Ukraine strikes critical targets in Russia close to major cities, the Russian military can enable the Cubans to strike targets inside the U.S. or strike U.S. interests, she said. And 3 Russian warships arrived at Cuba's Savannah Bay on Wednesday, greeted by a 21-cannon salute. A nuclear-powered submarine was also expected to arrive after them, and Russia has said the submarine, the Kazan, is not carrying nuclear weapons. Oh, well, that's a relief. Of course, we know Putin wouldn't lie. The arrival of the ships comes after Putin suggested he may authorize strikes on the U.S. via proxy countries, which he said is precisely what the U.S. is doing in Ukraine. Most of all, the warships are a reminder to Washington that it is unpleasant when an adversary meddles in your near abroad, said Benjamin Ganon, director of the Latin American program at the Washington-based Wilson Center think tank. It also reminds Russia's friends in the region, including U.S. antagonists Cuba and Venezuela, that Moscow is on their side. And the arrival of the ships comes after Russian President Vladimir Putin suggested he may authorize strikes on the U.S. via proxy countries, which he said is precisely, as the article said earlier, what the U.S. is doing in Ukraine. Putin made a direct threat to supply weapons to nearby neighbors of the U.S. last week. So again, the wars and rumors of wars things, and I don't know what it is. I mean, I have an opinion on why the U.S. and let me just pause for a moment. The United States is not in Bible prophecy. No mention of us whatsoever. which obviously should be a matter of concern for us all as to the why of that. But the truth of the matter is, the world's greatest superpower, the most generous nation in the history of the world, is not even a little blip or given an honorable mention in the last days. And we are not part of what's going to happen at the time of the Ezekiel war. We don't protest. We don't say anything. As Ezekiel talks about, the Arab Gulf states are the ones that protest the invasion of Israel from the north. And there's no mention of the U.S. And we are not the young lions from the West or any of that, because that's in reference to the Arab Gulf states and all that. And again, we are not present in the last days. Now, I don't think that we are destroyed militarily. I think we're going to follow exactly what the Roman Empire did and implode from the inside. And we won't be conquered from without, because we're doing everything that brought about the elimination of the Roman Empire as the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, as Edward Gibbon wrote in his book. And what were they doing? Well, free bread for the masses is what he wrote in his book. Sports becoming more and more violent, his book also recorded. Entertainment is one of the words he used. And also the breakdown of the home, the lack of respect for religious belief systems. All of these things are happening in the United States. And you can add to that delusion. It's just crazy what people think and believe and act upon in these last days. Israel has 1,200 plus people ruthlessly murdered, and they respond, and what happens? The world sides with Israel's enemies, the perpetrators of this heinous crime against the Jewish people. Now, Fox News says terror fears mount after arrest of border crossers linked to ISIS. We're headed for another 9/11, the article says. And fears are growing that the migrant crisis at the southern border is compromising America's national security after the arrest of 8 suspected terrorists with ties to ISIS. The fact that these 8 ISIS suspects got through the southern border is a travesty, retired Army General Dana Petard told Fox and Friends on Wednesday. And 8 Tajikistan nationals were busted by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, in conjunction with the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force in 3 major cities, a federal source confirmed to Fox News. The arrest took place in New York City, Los Angeles, and Philadelphia in recent days, according to the source. All 8 crossed the U.S. southern border illegally, and according to a federal source familiar with the sting, no derogatory information was initially flagged with the U.S. Customs and Border Protection or with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security during processing. It's frightening, and we're headed for another 9/11, New York City Democrat Councilman Robert Holden told Fox News on Wednesday. I predicted that. I think we should have a secure border. We should know who's coming into our country, and we don't. And millions of migrants and illegal aliens have gotten through. So it's a situation that we're just, really rolling the dice here. Petard said the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force and these individuals on their radar, and then ICE was able to make the arrest. ISIS-K is extremely dangerous as a terrorist organization, so we must all be vigilant, Petard warned. It really takes everybody watching in their communities for any suspicious activity and making sure they talk to law enforcement, police, and about anything that seems suspicious. Now, here's the interesting thing. You pair what he just said with the fact that saying anything about anybody today is considered to be hate, making some claim that's contrary to long-held beliefs and biological truths and all the other things that we see happening today. You're deemed a hater. If you believe that if you're biologically a male, you stay that no matter what kind of clothing you wear, whether you put on lipstick or any of those other things, you can't change your biological sex. And so they created this mirage that gender is basically a cultural thing. It's not really hard and fast. And yet, any of the dictionaries that haven't changed the definition yet, you look up gender, and the definition is one's biological sex at birth. But today, you say anything like that, to somebody, and you risk arrest and all the other things we see going on. So, here, tell the police, oh, this person's a terrorist. Oh, well, you're just basically racist because they're from another country. And this is how this thing goes. And let me just say, we are a mess. Our world is a mess, but Jesus said it would be a mess. And that just popped in my head. But listen, dominion theology is a lie. The church does not have to have dominion over 7 seats of power, as reported by the 7 Mountain Mandate from those who are part of the New Apostolic Reformation. We don't have to have control for Jesus to come back. We don't have to control the media. It's completely out of control. We don't have to control education. We don't have to control government at any level. We don't have to control anything for Jesus to come back. As a matter of fact, Jesus made it quite clear that he is coming back when things are completely out of control. And he likened them to the days of Noah. How bad were they in the days of Noah? Violence filled the earth. The thoughts and intents of man's heart was only evil continually. The whole world was corrupt before God, according to the Genesis narrative. And that's exactly where we are. Listen, so we don't need to, buy into this kind of nonsense, and be careful about being in places where such things are taught. Because one of the interesting things that's a reality in the realm of biblical teaching is when you find one lie, there will always be others. And it's just not true. We do not have to have dominion over the earth for Jesus to come back. After all, we're not to make this place ready for him. He's gone to make his place ready for us. And we will join him along with the dead in Christ and meet him and them in the air and forever be with the Lord. And our destination, according to Jesus in John 14, is the Father's house. And in his house, there are many mansions. And he said, if it were not so, I would have told you. And he's going to where he is that we may be there also. He'll come again and meet us so we can be where he is. Now, this is one of those stories where you think, things just can't get any more evil, any more bizarre than maybe one of the previous stories or some of the things that we've been hearing ourselves or seeing on social media or the news media. But listen to this from the Gateway Pundit. And the article opens with 2 words, the headline that is, pure evil. A Clinton-appointed judge mocks a 75-year-old pro-life activist Catholic faith as she sentences her to prison for peacefully protesting at an abortion clinic. And the Biden Department of Justice convicted Paula Harlow, last year of federal conspiracy against the rights and faith offenses for peaceably protesting an abortion clinic in D.C. back in 2020. U.S. District Judge Colleen Kolar-Kotelly, a Clinton appointee, sentenced, now remember, 75 years old, praying at an abortion clinic. The judge sentenced her to 24 months in prison. But that's not all. She was the 10th defendant to be sentenced by the Biden regime related to the peaceful protest of the practice of abortion. Paulette Harlow, who is 75 years old, participated in a peaceful protest at a clinic in 2020 and didn't hurt anyone. And according to the Catholic News Agency, Harlow has significant health issues. Her husband fears she may die in prison. Paulette Harlow, 75, of Kingston, Massachusetts, here's the official statement, was sentenced in U.S. District Court today to 24 months incarceration for her role in a conspiracy that created a blockade at a Washington, D.C. reproductive health care clinic to prevent the clinic from providing and patients from receiving reproductive health services, the DOJ said in a press release earlier this month. No, she's trying to keep somebody from killing a baby. a human being. And Judge Cotelli mocked Paula Harlow's Christian faith when she sentenced her to prison as her husband begged for mercy, expressing his fear his wife would die alone in prison. The judge taunted the elderly woman and mocked her faith and told her to honor the tenets of her religion and not die in jail. Two other elderly defendants in their 70s were sentenced to more than 2 years in prison each. Joan Bell, 76, was sentenced to 27 months in prison and 3 years of supervised release, and Jean Marshall, 74, was sentenced to 24 months and 3 years of supervised release. What was their crime? Praying at an abortion clinic. And in their minds, the judge's minds, blocking access to reproductive health care. Well, I'm sorry, it's not very healthy to abort a baby for the baby. And again, just the world has lost its mind. And things are exactly as they were in Noah's day. Now, the specifics may be different. People may have thought differently, and I don't know that abortion was an issue back then. But forever, inside of a pregnant woman was a human child, and everybody believed that. That's why there was laws all over the country that if you killed a woman and she was pregnant, you're charged with double homicide. Or in a car accident, you're charged with the same thing, double manslaughter. Why? Because that's not fetal tissue. That's not a clump of cells. That is a human being inside of the mother's womb. So simplistic and yet denied vehemently. And the denial is supported by government, our government, and even imprisoning women in their mid to late 70s for praying for the lives of the unborn. You know, God is patient, isn't he? And I'm glad he is. I'm glad that he is long-suffering. I'm glad that he's not willing that any should perish. I'm glad that he desires that all would come to repentance. But, you know, there comes a time, like in Noah's day, and like at Sodom and Gomorrah, where judgment is necessary to stop the moral decay and the downward spiral of the whole of culture. And I think I've heard other things or thought other things in time past, but I don't know how much lower we can go. I don't know how much further we can sink. And let me just throw this out there. This just popped in my head because I live in California. You know, we're told about this whole Agenda 2032 and how, you know, no more, as Gavin Newsom has said, no more gas-powered vehicles will be allowed to be sold at that point in time, or manufactured, I should say. But get this, there are so many Teslas and other hybrid type of cars here in California that the massive tax put on gasoline is not getting paid. So guess what Gavin Newsom wants to do? He wants to charge everybody by the mile. You will be taxed according to how far you drive. And, you know, the interesting thing about this is that's not going to be hard if you have one of these electronic vehicles, because they communicate with the charging station, and, you know, they talk to your phone, all those things. So, you know, a lot of this technology can be used in a way that's not favorable at all. So it's not any big thing if your monthly mileage is reported to the government by your car, because that's the age in which we live, and the technology is there already in play. But there are so many electric powered cars here in California at this nearly $1 gas tax. It might be over that now. I haven't checked to see what it was, but the taxes, and, you know, again, when I travel around and go to other parts of the country, it just stuns me to see the cost of gas. And yet here in California, it's $1, sometimes $2 more than it is in other parts of the country. It's just bizarre. And this is evil. There's no other way to call it, no other thing to label it. It is just downright evil. And, you know, this woman sentencing, I'm not sure who sentenced the other two ladies, but we do know for sure she just sentenced a 75-year-old woman in poor health to 24 months incarceration. in just a horrific place, which should be housing criminals, but they're letting them go too. It's amazing. Come get us, Lord Jesus. I'm sure you'd agree. Now, one little positive thing, the Breitbart reports that a major step to protect women's sport. Trans swimmer Leah Thomas barred from the Olympics after losing a key lawsuit. Leah Thomas, the infamous transgender swimmer who won so many NCAA women's swimming titles in 2022, is barred from the 2024 Summer Olympics after losing a legal battle against the international group that governs swimming. Thomas attempted to bring a legal case against the World Aquatics at the Court of Arbitration for Sport in hopes of vacating the group's recent rules, placing heavy restrictions on trans athletes. The rules effectively bar someone like Thomas from competing in international competitions and also bar him from being considered for a slot on the U.S. women's swim team, according to The Guardian. And Thomas argued that the rules should be declared invalid and unlawful because, he says, they violate the Olympics Charter and the World Aquatics Constitution. Pardon me a moment. The court disagreed with Thomas and ruled that he had no standing. The court said Thomas is simply not entitled to engage with eligibility to compete in World Athletic compete, because he is not a current member of World Aquatics. The rules were implemented after Thomas caused outrage for winning the 2022 NCAA title and created a new language to prevent males who transition after puberty from competing as transgender females. That requirement rules out Thomas and most trans athletes. Still, World Aquatics did not get a chance to argue its rules on scientific data it used to arrive at its ban because Thomas' case was thrown out because he did not have standing to bring the case in the first place. And several other sports have banned men claiming to be women from competing as women. Can you imagine a trans woman, a guy boxing against a woman? I mean, it's just unbelievable, the things that are happening. Insane. Excuse me. I turned the fan on because it's hot, but then it dries out my throat and tickles me. Now, here's another story that just tells us how far we've fallen or how far our world has fallen. And it comes from LifeSite News. And Trudeau says nothing after another church suspiciously burns to the ground in Canada. By the way, this is number 33 since 2021. On Sunday, during the early morning hours, a 4-alarm fire ripped through the historic church, built in 1908. The Byzantine-style building burned almost to the ground in a matter of hours. Flames were shooting out of the roof and confirmed what many suspected. Everything is gone. There's no indication that anything was saved at this point, the Toronto Fire Services spokesman Deepak Chagger told the press, including murals by Group of 7 artists, as well as other prominent Canadians, were described as invaluable. The artwork was priceless, Father Don Byers, rector of St. Anne's, told the press. It was murals, beautiful murals. They were stunning, and this was the only church that featured artwork by the Group of 7. And I'm sorry to say that's been lost from what I can see. The murals on the dome and in the chancel were commissioned by the church in 1923 and included the work of J.E.H. MacDonald, Franklin Carmichael, and Frederick Varley. Obviously important artists. In Canada, this is an extraordinary loss, Byers said after the firefighters extinguished the flame mid-Sunday morning. And not only was the art important, but the church itself was important architecturally. It was one of the rare Anglican churches that was in the Byzantine style, an early Christian style. And Councillor Alejandro Brava, who represents the ward, noted that the residents of the Little Portugal neighborhood where the church once stood were expressing enormous grief over a site that we cannot replace in Canada and in the world. Authorities have yet to announce any theory as to how the blaze began, but the fire was already raging through the building by the time fire crews arrived on Sunday morning. And the firefighters had to pull out of the building quickly due to the risk of collapse. And Father Byers expressed bewilderment as to how the fire started. Nobody was here. The church was locked, secure. All the lights were off, he said. It's a real mystery as to how this even happened. He's usually the first one to arrive at church in the morning, yet we do not know what started the conflagration that leveled St. Anne's, designated National Historic Site. But it's worth noting that over 100 churches have been vandalized or torched since 2021, when the press began to push the story of a mass grave near a residential school in Kamloops, and of those, 33 burned to the ground. Back in January, the author noted that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had yet to dedicate a single speech to the unprecedented attacks on Canadian churches, but that when the number of churches attacked was 68, Trudeau appointed a special representative to combat Islamophobia. Churches are burning down, and so he appoints someone to combat Islamophobia. When the count was at 83, Liberal and NDP members of Parliament at the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Committee voted to adjourn to avoid considering a motion put forward by a Conservative member of Parliament denouncing the destruction of churches. Indeed, Trudeau has yet to comment on the destruction of the Group of Seven church burning down. He did, however, send out another tweet condemning Islamophobia just yesterday, nearly 12 hours after the fire at St. Anne's was put out, noting that Canadians have seen how dangerous and ugly Islamophobia is, and we have to keep confronting it wherever and whenever we see it. It's just absolutely bizarre, the people in places of leadership and their incompetence today. One last story here, and it comes from a blog actually called The Economic Collapse. Listen to this headline. Enormous mobs are literally taking over the streets of major U.S. cities on a nightly basis. Every night, huge groups of young people are literally taking over the streets in large cities all over America. In many cases, major intersections are completely blocked off for stunts and dangerous competitions involving vehicles. There's a few areas where you can drive around in our own neighborhood and you can see the skid marks from kids out doing donuts in the streets. Now, that's always been happening. When I was a kid, people were doing the same kind of thing, drag racing and all that. But, now we're seeing this as a form of a hostile takeover. And these events are called street takeovers, and they are often accompanied by theft, violence, and other acts of crime. Again, when I was a kid, when these things would happen, the big thrill was to try and outrun the cops and not get a ticket or have your car taken or license. But now we have these things accompanied by theft, violence, and other acts of crime. You've probably heard of street takeovers happening in big metropolitan areas such as LA, Seattle, New York, and Chicago. But at this point, they are even happening in many rural areas. In fact, the author says, I just came across an article about how street takeovers have become a major problem in the state of Maine. As you will see later in the article, the scale of these events is so large that police will just sit back and do nothing to stop them. When they are outnumbered 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1, the police are extremely hesitant to try and break things up. Some of the biggest street takeovers in the nation occur in Northern California, and this past weekend was no exception. And in San Francisco, it's mentioned, police refused to intervene, and not a single arrest was made. And all the article describes a terrifying night of sideshows took Oakland and the waterfront by storm. Smoke was rising, greeting San Franciscans on their way to work in the morning. The police know that these events are going to happen, but they do nothing to prevent them. And as they're taking place, the police just watch and make no arrests. I suppose that is one way to get the crime rate to go down. Of course, lots of crimes are being committed at these events, but in many cases, people are being seriously injured. Onlookers were sent flying as cars plowed into them at one event in Oakland. A torched Chevy provided a grisly centerpiece to the Embarcadero spectacle as tires smoke reduced visibility to near zero. We're on our own here, tweeted one resident. Why do we pay taxes again? I think that's a very good question. Why should residents pay taxes if the police are not going to protect them? It was also reported that a Chevy Camaro was set on fire, and at one of the street takeovers, a motorist was beaten and hauled out of his car. And vehicles and spectators melted away as police eventually arrived with reinforcements. But by 3 a.m., the action had moved to the intersection of Valencia and Cesar Chavez Drive in the Mission District, where passengers clung to vehicles as their drivers struggled to maintain control. During one street takeover, a mob of approximately 50 young people decided to loot a nearby AutoZone store in Los Angeles. And local media outlet KTLA reported that LA Police Department received multiple calls of a street takeover at the intersection of Century Boulevard and Hoover at around 4 a.m. local time. Then minutes later, a mob of 50 people looted a nearby AutoZone, and officials believe other stores were hit as well. At least 3 businesses were hit within a 4-mile radius, and authorities were working to determine if the crimes were connected. Oh, give me a break. Gee, I wonder if one had anything to do with the others. And of course, the criminals in LA are going to steal stuff whenever there's a street takeover going on or not. And at this point, theft has become so rampant in Los Angeles that even fire hydrants are being stolen on a daily basis. What are you going to do with a fire hydrant? Of what value is it? It's just stealing to steal. And a California water company has responded to an ever-growing rash of fire hydrant thefts in LA by installing lock shields to cover the bolts on the hydrants to stop the thieves. Again, the world has lost its mind. And, times are perilous, and no question about that. And that's why we need not hesitate to wonder if we're in the last days or even to say so. Things are just beyond bizarre. And I think the fire hydrant thing is of crucial importance for us to recognize that there is no reason. I mean, people try and justify people stealing to feed their kids or any of those kind of things. And you can't use that for big screen TVs and fire hydrants. You don't need to steal those things. They're stealing to steal. And again, this is the days in which we live. And I can't think of any other takeaway than just simply Jesus is coming soon. Perilous times are upon us. Truth has been defected from, both scripturally in many cases, as well as morally and biologically, scientifically, if you will. And the world has completely lost its mind. Wars and rumors of wars abound. We have atmospheric and geological events happening all over the world in increasing frequency and intensity, strange things happening in our weather, strange things happening geologically, and massive earthquakes and all the other things we've been talking about for a long time. But they're at a different level now. And, what was said of the Florida rainfall was either 500 and 1,000-year type events. In other words, that's how rare they are. They only happen every 1,000 years. Well, when you pair that up with the rest of the things going on, our only conclusion is we need to be looking that way because Jesus is coming soon. And not only that, we need to be reaching out to others. And pastor, wonderful man of God, Pastor Raul Reese, I heard him say one time that if you believe Jesus could come soon, then act like it. I think that's a pretty awesome challenge. If we really believe it, then we should act like it. We should be telling others about him and how to escape the things that are going to come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth, as Revelation 3:10 says. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us. And please be praying. Pray for people, who say, make a comment, pray for my son, pray for my cousin, pray for my wife, my husband, pray for my health, whatever it is. Let's make sure we're praying. And please, as always, enjoy the fellowship and the chat and all those other things. But pay attention when somebody mentions a real need. And let's kind of all jump on the prayer chain thing and be praying for people. And again, I mentioned my sister, my younger sister, and pancreatic cancer. My older sister has already gone to be with the Lord. And when I say older, we're not that old. She was very young to have a very strange disease, so to speak, that took her life when she was far too young to go. But she's in the presence of the Lord. And my younger sister now has had pancreatic cancer for some 17 months, and she's filled with joy and just loving life and loving the Lord. And the doctors just don't even know what to say. Well, I do. Praise the Lord. Thank the Lord for his hearing our prayers. So let's make sure we're praying for each other and praying for the lost too. Don't give up. Don't give up on praying for your prodigal. Don't give up on praying for your lost loved one. Don't give up on praying, period, because God answers prayer. Well, again, that's it for this week. And thank you again for joining us. And if you don't mind, please make sure you share this, as it's just so kooky. You say something about, Israel, and Google just kind of puts the clamp on you and all that. And we've just seen weird but not surprising stuff happen with this program and anything else that's put up on the truth about God. So again, thank you for joining us this evening, and I'll see you here, there, or in the air. God bless.